We cleaned out the garage last month, my mother said over the phone, her voice flat, distant. Donated most of it. You weren't really using any of it anyway. I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, and asked her, my voice already shaking, whether that included the box of my father's old letters, my childhood yearbooks, and the small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother, the one my mother always said would be mine someday. Some of it, probably, she said, like she was describing leftovers she'd thrown out of the refrigerator. You made your choice 2 years ago. We just finally accepted it. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, hit the like button now. If you've ever stayed silent while someone underestimated you, comment here below. And subscribe to Story Retribution because today's ending proves that karma always arrives, just not when people expect it. My name is Amara, and 3 years ago I fell in love with a man named David, a kind, thoughtful person who happened to come from a different faith and a different cultural background than the one I was raised in. My parents, Kavita and Suresh, had always been loving, present, involved parents throughout my childhood, but they were also deeply traditional, and somewhere beneath the warmth I'd known my entire life was a rigid expectation about who I would eventually marry, an expectation I hadn't fully understood the depth of until I fell in love with someone who didn't fit it. The small betrayal happened the night I told my parents about David, sitting at our family dinner table where I'd shared every important update of my life for 26 years. My mother went quiet in a way I'd never seen before. My father set down his fork and asked carefully whether I'd really thought this through, whether I understood what this would mean for the family's reputation, whether love was really worth what he called this kind of complication. I tried for months to help them see David the way I saw him, patient, gentle, deeply respectful of my culture even as he brought his own into our relationship. I invited them to dinners, encouraged phone calls, gave them every opportunity to know him as a person rather than a category. My mother remained politely cold. My father grew increasingly distant. Conversations between us shrinking to brief, obligatory check-ins that felt more like formalities than actual relationship. The bigger betrayal arrived when David proposed 18 months into our relationship, and I called my parents, still hopeful despite everything, to share the news. The silence on the phone lasted long enough that I finally asked if they were still there. We can't support this, my father said quietly. If you marry him, you're choosing to walk away from everything we raised you to value. I begged them to reconsider, explained that marrying David didn't mean abandoning the culture, the traditions, the family I'd grown up loving at the sense, it simply meant expanding what our family looked like. My mother cried on the phone, not out of softening, but out of what she called grief. Grief for the daughter I thought I raised. They didn't attend my wedding. Not the ceremony, not the reception, not even a phone call that day. I stood at the altar surrounded by David's warm, welcoming family and my own small circle of friends who showed up in exactly the way my parents chose not to, and I smiled through a joy that carried an unmistakable ache running underneath it the entire day. For the following 2 years, contact with my parents dwindled to occasional, strained holiday calls. My mother sometimes crying quietly on the phone about how much she missed me, my father rarely speaking at all during these calls, his silence somehow louder than anything he could have said. I kept trying anyway. I sent photos from our first apartment. I called on their anniversaries. I told them gently, whenever the opportunity arose, that the door was always open, that I loved them despite everything, that I hoped someday they'd find a way to be part of my life again without conditions attached. About 6 months ago, my mother mentioned during one of our brief calls that she and my father were finally selling the family home, downsizing into a smaller condo now that I had moved out permanently and my younger brother, Ravi, had moved across the country for work. I offered immediately to come help sort through decades of belongings, genuinely hoping the shared task might create space for something to heal between us. My mother told me it wasn't necessary, that they had it handled, that I shouldn't feel obligated to be involved in something that would require me coming back to a house that, she said carefully, held complicated memories now. I didn't push. I trusted, foolishly perhaps, that whatever they packed and moved would eventually make its way to me the way family belongings usually do, even amid complicated relationships. Then, last month, during a routine call checking in on the moving process, my mother mentioned casually that they'd finished clearing out the garage. We cleaned out the garage last month, she said. Donated most of it. You weren't really using any of it anyway. Something cold moved through me. What exactly did you donate? I asked. Old boxes, mostly, she said. Things from when you and Ravi were kids. We kept what mattered. I asked, my voice already shaking, about specific things. My father's old letters he'd written me during a business trip when I was 12, ones I'd treasured enough to keep in a labeled box my entire adult life. My childhood yearbooks, spanning kindergarten through senior year, filled with friends' signatures and memories I'd always assumed would eventually be something I shared with my own children someday. My grandmother's small wooden jewelry box, the one containing her wedding bangles, the one my mother had promised for as long as I could remember would be mine. Some of it, probably, my mother said, her voice unsettlingly casual, like she was discussing furniture rather than the physical remnants of my entire childhood. You made your choice 2 years ago. We just finally accepted it. I sat on my kitchen floor after that call for a long time, unable to fully process what she'd just told me. My grandmother's jewelry, bangles that had survived partition, survived immigration, survived decades of careful preservation specifically so they could be passed down, discarded because my parents had decided, somewhere in their grief and disapproval, that I had stopped being family the moment I chose who to love. I didn't confront them immediately. I needed time to understand exactly what had happened, needed to know whether there was any possibility of recovering what had been lost before I said anything that couldn't be unsaid. I called the donation center my mother mentioned, a local thrift organization, and explained the situation as calmly as I could manage. The manager, sympathetic but honest, told me that donated items typically moved through their system within days, sorted, priced, and placed on shelves almost immediately given constant donation volume. Recovering specific items after even a few weeks was, realistically, close to impossible. I called my brother Ravi, hoping he might have some insight into what exactly had been packed, what might still exist somewhere. Ravi, it turned out, had been unaware of any of it, having been consumed by his own cross-country move during the same period our parents were clearing out the house. They didn't tell me any of this, Ravi said, clearly troubled. I would have said something. I would have come to get your stuff myself if I'd known. Ravi and I began piecing together the full timeline over the following days, and what emerged was even harder to accept than I'd initially realized. Our parents hadn't simply overlooked my belongings during a chaotic move. According to Ravi, who eventually spoke carefully with our father, they had made a deliberate decision months earlier, discussing openly between themselves that keeping my things felt dishonest given how thoroughly they'd tried to accept that I'd chosen a different path than the one they'd envisioned for our family. They hadn't simply forgotten me in the chaos of downsizing. They had decided consciously that the daughter who married outside their expectations no longer deserved the physical remnants of the childhood they'd raised her through. The public reveal, if it can be called that, happened at Ravi's engagement party 3 weeks later, a gathering our parents attended fully, warmly, embracing Ravi's fiancé with an ease and enthusiasm I hadn't experienced from them in over 3 years. I attended too, choosing not to stay away, despite everything, wanting to support my brother regardless of the ache sitting heavy in my chest the entire evening. David came with me, patient and supportive as always, standing quietly beside me through polite, strained interactions with my parents that felt more like formalities exchanged between distant acquaintances than an actual family reunion. During a quiet moment near the dessert table, my mother approached me, her expression softer than I'd seen in years. You look happy, she said, almost surprised, glancing briefly at David before looking away. I am happy, I said carefully, despite everything. She nodded, an uncomfortable silence stretching between us. Then, gently, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for 3 weeks. Did you know, I said quietly, that Grandma's jewelry box was in that garage? The one with her wedding bangles? My mother's face changed instantly, something flickering across it that looked almost like recognition, almost like dawning horror. I told the movers to keep the good jewelry aside, she said slowly. In a separate box, I thought. It wasn't kept aside, I said. It was donated, along with Dad's letters, along with every yearbook from my entire childhood. Wait, what? My father said, appearing beside my mother, having overheard the last part of our conversation. You told me you'd finished clearing the garage, I said, turning to my mother. You told me you donated most of it because I wasn't using it anyway. You told me you'd accepted my choice. My mother's face had gone pale, tears forming rapidly. I never told anyone to throw away your grandmother's jewelry, she said, her voice breaking. I told the moving company explicitly to set aside anything sentimental. I don't understand how. Kavita, my father said quietly, his own voice unsteady now. Did you actually check what they packed before it went to donation? Or did you tell them what to do and trust it happened? My mother's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. The realization seemed to hit her all at once, standing there at her son's engagement party, surrounded by warm string lights and celebratory conversation continuing obliviously around us. She hadn't personally, deliberately thrown away her mother's jewelry, her granddaughter's yearbooks, her husband's old letters. But she had been distant enough, disconnected enough from my life over the previous 2 years, that she hadn't been present enough during the move to actually ensure the things that mattered were protected the way she'd promised. Her disapproval of my marriage had created exactly enough distance for genuine, irreversible loss to slip through unnoticed. I'm so sorry, my mother said, tears falling freely now. I don't know how this happened. I never wanted this. I was angry, and I let that anger create distance, and now. She stopped, unable to finish. The weight of what had actually been lost finally landing fully. The family reactions unfolded slowly around us at the party, a few relatives noticing the tension, drifting closer with quiet concern. Ravi, hearing enough of the conversation to understand what had happened, walked over immediately, his own expression tight with anger on my behalf. How could this happen? He asked our parents directly. How does Grandma's jewelry just disappear because nobody was paying close enough attention? My father, uncharacteristically emotional, finally spoke. Because we let our disapproval matter more than our daughter, he said quietly. For 3 years, we let it matter more, and now the things that connected us to your grandmother, to your entire childhood, are simply gone because we were too consumed by being right to protect what actually mattered. I didn't feel triumphant standing there, surrounded by tears and quiet devastation at my brother's engagement celebration. I felt something far heavier, the specific, irreversible grief of losing physical pieces of a childhood I couldn't get back, layered painfully over years of emotional distance that had made this loss possible in the first place. The emotional resolution that followed wasn't neat or immediate. My parents spent the following months trying, awkwardly, imperfectly, to rebuild something with David and me, my mother crying more than once over what she called the jewelry that should have outlived all of us. My father slowly, hesitantly, allowing David into conversations he'd avoided for years. Some things couldn't be recovered. My grandmother's bangles were gone, likely resold somewhere, scattered among strangers who would never know the decades of history they carried. My childhood yearbooks, my father's letters, gone the same way, small physical anchors to a life that now existed only in memory. But something else, slowly, began to grow in their place. My parents started showing up more consistently, actual phone calls instead of obligatory holiday check-ins, an invitation to Sunday dinners that included David without hesitation, small, imperfect gestures toward rebuilding what their disapproval had nearly destroyed entirely. The final lesson settled over me gradually, months after that engagement party, holding what few photographs I'd managed to independently save over the years. The physical gaps where my grandmother's jewelry should have been sitting in my own home someday. My parents had spent 3 years assuming that disapproval could simply exist alongside love without consequence, that they could withhold acceptance from my marriage while still preserving everything else about our relationship unaffected. They mistook distance for a temporary, harmless stance rather than what it actually became, a space wide enough for something irreplaceable to disappear without anyone noticing until it was already too late. I never raised my voice at that engagement party beyond the quiet ache already sitting in it. I didn't need to. The truth of what had been lost arriving quietly during a celebration meant for someone else's happiness said everything 3 years of distance had built toward without either of us fully realizing it until the damage was already permanent. Karma doesn't always arrive as justice. Sometimes it simply arrives as grief. showing everyone involved exactly what disapproval costs when it's allowed to sit quietly for too long, teaching a lesson that comes far too late to undo what's already been lost, but early enough, hopefully, to protect whatever still remains. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my situation? If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, emotional drama, shocking revenge, and the justice that always finds its way back, subscribe to Story Retribution and turn on the bell so you never miss the next story. Tomorrow's story might be even more unbelievable. See you then. Peace.